Our next speaker is Tim Barker. Tim Barker is an independent researcher who focuses most of his attention on the Book of Abraham, the Pentateuch, and higher criticism. He blogs at ldsstudies.blogspot.com and bookofabraham.blogspot.com, and he's participated in many areas where he's volunteered. With that, I'm going to turn the time over to Tim Barker.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Not everybody listening to this presentation may be fluent or even familiar with the controversies regarding the Book of Abraham. I'll not attempt to summarize every criticism leveled against the Book of Abraham here, of course, but I will be addressing the primary argument that has been used against the translation of the Book of Abraham for over 50 years now. The substance of this argument has not changed, nor has it been materially improved upon since it was put forth by Grant Heward and Heward-Tanner in 1968. The only noticeable changes to this argument since 1968 has been with respect to the aesthetics in presentation. A number of responses to Heward and Tanner's theory have been put forward from 1968 through the present. However, I will not be reviewing the history of these responses, and I will only touch upon a few of them briefly. My intent is to provide another piece of evidence regarding this topic that seems to have been overlooked for the past 5 decades. I did not expect my observations to settle the controversy or solve the mysteries of the Kirtland and Nauvoo Egyptian papers, but it is another piece of the puzzle that should help clarify and nullify Heward and Tanner's popular theory regarding the Book of Abraham translation. Backing up for a moment, Michael Chandler arrived in Kirtland, Ohio in late June or early July 1835 with 4 mummies and some papyri. Joseph and the saints purchased the mummies and the papyri, and the earliest contemporary source describing the content of the acquisition comes from W. Phelps, who wrote a letter to his wife Sally in Missouri 3 weeks after Chandler arrived. Phelps wrote, "There were 2 papyrus rolls, besides some other ancient Egyptian writings with them. These papyrus rolls, according to Phelps, contain the records of Joseph and Abraham." Whether both were on the same scroll or one on each is not clearly specified by Phelps. In December 1835, Oliver Cowdery wrote to William Fry, similarly stating that there were 2 rolls of papyrus with 2 or 3 other small pieces of papyrus, with astronomical calculations, epitaphs, etc., were found with others of the mummies. He also stated that the writings of Abraham and Joseph were beautifully written on papyrus with black and a small part red ink or paint in perfect preservation. Again, it isn't entirely clear whether both records were on the same scroll or on separate rolls of papyri based on these observations, but Cowdery does state that Abraham and Joseph's writings included black and red ink. By 1842, some of the fragments of papyri were already preserved in a chest of drawers and framed in glass. Henry Caswell, an Anglican clergyman visiting Nauvoo, wrote, "Joseph proceeded to what appeared to be a small chest of drawers. From this he drew forth a number of glazed slides like picture frames containing sheets of papyrus with Egyptian inscriptions and hieroglyphics." In no uncertain terms, Caswell observed JSP 1, or Facsimile 1 in the Book of Abraham, as part of this collection of papyrus fragments framed in glass. Quote, "Pointing to the figure of a man lying on a table, he, Joseph, said, 'That is the picture of Abraham on the point of being sacrificed. That man standing by him with a drawn knife is an idolatrous priest of the Egyptians. Abraham prayed to God, who immediately unloosed his bands and delivered him," end quote. So no later than 1842, a number of papyrus fragments, either ends of rolls that were damaged and or some of the other papyri that Phelps and Cowdery referred to, were preserved in glass frames and cabinet drawers. This is further confirmed 2 years later, and a month before Joseph's martyrdom, when Josiah Quincy Jr. and Charles Francis Adams visited Nauvoo, and Quincy wrote, "Some parchments inscribed with hieroglyphics were then offered to us. They were preserved under glass and handled with great respect." We know, however, that not all of the papyri were framed in glass. On February 19, 1843, Charlotte Haven wrote to her mother about her visit in Nauvoo and described her experience with the mummies and papyri, explaining that Lucy Mack Smith opened a long roll of papyrus on top of a long table, set her candlestick down, and explained that the roll contained the writings of Abraham and Isaac. Either Lucy or Charlotte probably meant Abraham and Joseph. Charlotte also mentioned seeing another roll of papyrus. There are other eyewitness accounts, but time will not permit further exploration here. That's certainly been addressed previously as well. My purpose is to point out that there were 2 rolls of papyrus separate from the fragments of papyri that were preserved in glass frames. It seems that the fragments preserved under glass comprised a lot of papyri that were eventually sold to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1947, while the 2 rolls and some other fragments would eventually end up in Wood's Museum in Chicago and subsequently burned in the Great Chicago of 1871. In November 1967, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints acquired 11 papyri fragments from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This came as quite a surprise to church members, since it was believed that all of Joseph's papyri had been burned in the Chicago fire. Announcement and discussion of the papyri was published in the church's January 1968 issue of the Improvement Era. The following month, in the February 1968 Improvement Era, images of the papyri were published, and each papyrus fragment was numbered 1 through 11. Papyrus fragment 9 was actually a recovered document from the church historian's library or office, and 2 papyri fragments from the Met were labeled 3A and 3B, so the numbering constitutes JSP 1 through JSP 11. Later that year, Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, devoted almost 40 pages of their quarterly journal to discussion and partial translation of the papyri. Part of that discussion included a short article by Grant Heward and Gerald Tanner, who wrote, "It now appears that the papyrus fragments recently recovered by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints include the text used by Joseph Smith to translate the Book of Abraham. Their argument is based on the following evidence. The church recovered Facsimile 1 from the Book of Abraham, known as JSP 1, based on the labeling from the Improvement Era from February 1968. And please note that facsimiles 2 and 3 were not recovered. JSP 1, 11, 10, not pictured here, and facsimile 3, also not pictured, from the Book of Abraham, belonged to the same scroll and belonged to a Theban priest named Hor. And this scroll dates from the 2nd century BC. JSP 1 and 11 are appropriately adjacent to each other, and because facsimile 1 is at, or rather near, the beginning of the record, the text following the vignette must obviously be the Book of Abraham. According to Heward-Tanner, quote, "It would seem that Joseph Smith studied this fragment and concluded that it was written by Abraham. Then Joseph or his scribes copied down a character or 2 at a time, and to the right of each character rendered a translation of its meaning. These translations comprise the original manuscript version of the Book of Abraham." So referring to JSP 11, Joseph's scribes copied characters, presumably his scribes copied the characters, from right to left and top to bottom, and then juxtaposed this hieratic text next to the Book of Abraham text. So for example, You can look at hieratic characters from JSP 11 and see those same characters in the left margin of the Book of Abraham manuscripts from the Kirtland Egyptian Papers corpus, with corresponding Book of Abraham text juxtaposed next to those characters. There are actually 3 Book of Abraham manuscripts within the Kirtland Egyptian Papers collection. Labeled by the Joseph Smith Papers as A, B, and C, using our current versification, A was written by Frederick G. Williams and contained Abraham chapter 1, verse 4 through chapter 2, verse 6. B was written by Warren Parrish and contained Abraham chapter 1, verse 4 through chapter 2, verse 2. And C was written by W. W. Phelps, containing Abraham chapter 1, verse 1 through 3, and Warren Parrish, containing chapter 1, verse 4 through 2, verse 18. Little attention has been paid to the question of why 3 separate documents exist, why they cover different ranges of verses, how the similarities and differences between manuscripts can be explained, why Warren Parrish wrote 2 of the documents, etc. Certainly further work remains to be done on these manuscripts. The Joseph Smith Papers has done a tremendous work in making the complete data available online and in published format in the Revelations and Translation Series, Volume 4. This preliminary work could be taken even further by somebody with relevant credentials in linguistics and textual criticism. Nonetheless, these next slides shown illustrate the portion of Joseph Smith Papyri 11 copied, the hieratic character presumably drawn by Phelps, Parrish, or Williams in the Kirtland Egyptian Papers, and the Book of Abraham text next to the hieratic characters. The approach is consistent for the first 3 and the 3rd lines of hieratic text from JSP 11. Although you'll see that the extent of usage varies from each Book of Abraham manuscript, but in the case of Book of Abraham manuscript C, the identified hieratic characters gets us through Abraham chapter 2, verse 18. There's no other similar extant documents accounting for the remainder of the Book of Abraham. Or any other further usage of the hieratic characters in this fashion with respect to the text of the Book of Abraham. This doesn't stop Heward and Tanner from speculating, though. They wrote that, quote, Joseph Smith apparently translated many English words from each Egyptian character. The characters from fewer than 4 lines of the papyrus make up 49 verses of the Book of Abraham, containing more than 2,000 words. If Joseph Smith continued to translate the same number of English words from each Egyptian character, this one small piece of papyrus, pictured in illustration number 1, appears to be the whole of the Book of Abraham, end quote. This argument is begging the question, though. It assumes first that the project is entirely Joseph Smith's doing. Again, addressing the differences between the manuscripts, the duplication of Parrish's work, the differences between the published Book of Abraham and the manuscripts, the methodology formulating this work, the context of the various language projects beginning in 1835, and the likeliness of a pre-existing Book of Abraham text are all separate topics. But I want to show that this data is the basis for the Heward and Tanner argument. I'll return to the Kirtland Egyptian Papers, but the evidence presented thus far was sufficient for Heward and Tanner to conclude the Egyptian has been translated and it has no recognizable connection with the subject matter of the Book of Abraham, end quote. Therefore, based on their conclusion, Joseph was mistaken, and his translation of the Book of Abraham does not match the translation made by Egyptologists from the same hieratic text, so Joseph's translation wasn't a real translation. This evidence would seem to be a slam dunk. It's the same argument that's been repeated for over 50 years and has heavily influenced the interpretation of the papyri for many who have lost their faith. According to an unsolicited survey and report on faith crises in 2013, with over 3,000 responders, the Book of Abraham tied for first place as the most important church history reason for a faith crisis. This is quite unfortunate. So let's take a closer look now and make some observations. As Carrie Muhlstein pointed out in 2005, quote, "Since the modern discovery of the Joseph Smith papyri, the text has been translated by Richard A. Parker, Klaus Baer, Hugh W. Nibley, Robert K. Rittner twice, and actually a third time since Muhlstein's publication, and Michael D. Rhodes. 3 of these Egyptologists are not and have never been members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. 2 of them are Latter-day Saints. And all of them are legitimate Egyptologists, and all of them agree that JSP 1, 11, 10, and Facsimile 3 from Hoare's copy of the Document of Breathings made by Isis. As John Gee has stated, the Egyptologists and the apologists say the same thing. The Document of Breathings made by Isis is not the Book of Abraham. In other words, the primary argument that Joseph could not translate because the hieratic text that he is presumed to have translated does not match the translation from Egyptologists is a straw man argument. Both sides, generally speaking, agree that JSP 11 is not the Book of Abraham. The argument all along has hinged upon the Book of Abraham manuscripts from the Kirtland Egyptian papers. Heward-Tanner's argument is entirely dependent on the Book of Abraham being derived from the hieratic characters from JSP 11. While we don't have any commentary from Joseph Smith regarding these Book of Abraham manuscripts, we also do not have any commentary on these manuscripts from his closest friends, counselors, or scribes, such as W. W. Phelps, Frederick G. Williams, Oliver Cowdery, John Whitmer, or Sidney Rigdon. Although we do have a brief but vague comment by Warren Parrish in 1838, who wrote, quote, "I have set by his, Joseph's, side and penned down the translation of the Egyptian hieroglyphics as he claimed to receive it by direct inspiration of heaven," end quote. This is relevant, to be sure, but certainly inconclusive as to whether he was referring to the Book of Abraham manuscripts or other Egyptian materials, whether extant or no longer extant. What is also generally missing is relevant context, but again, we'll return to this later. Ironically, however, what we do have is commentary directly from Joseph Smith about JSP 11. I want to repeat that again. What we do have is direct commentary from Joseph Smith about JSP 11. And it was Grant Heward and Gerald Tanner who actually made this observation, but they stopped just short of its implications, just as every single one of their successors have done. Tanner and Heward wrote, "It is interesting to note that not only the manuscripts of the Book of Abraham, but also facsimile number 2 includes portions of this Book of Breathings. Evidently, the original of facsimile 2 is damaged. The missing areas on this drawing have been filled in with insertions from other documents to make facsimile 2 as it now exists," end quote. They're referring to a drawing from the Nauvoo Egyptian papers of a damaged hypocephalus. The actual hypocephalus was presumably burned in the Chicago fire as well. But this drawing, which clearly became facsimile number 2 in the Book of Abraham, has been preserved. Willard Richards probably drew the hypocephalus, since he wrote the explanations for the figures of this facsimile in the Nauvoo Egyptian papers. The lacunae for facsimile 2 did indeed come from other parts of the Joseph Smith papyri. I've highlighted a third of the hypocephalus rim of figure 18, the right-hand side of the rim, and half of figures 13, 14, and 15 on the right-hand side as well. Just as Heward and Tanner depicted in their 1968 article, these highlighted portions can all be traced back to JSP 11. Starting with the rim, or figure 18, I've laid the semicircular text in a horizontal row. The text was inserted upside down, but when turned right side up and flipped around, the text can be aligned with hieratic text in JSP 11 from rows 2, 3, and 4. The transfer of hieratic text to the hypocephalus isn't as clean as one might have hoped for, but a clear match can be made when looking closely at JSP 11 in facsimile number 2, and in the case of JSP 11 row 4, from Book of Abraham manuscript C. Now regarding row 2, I think there's some ambiguity regarding the hieratic characters drawn, but these seem to be the closest matches. So whether that's duplicated or a separate character is a little bit ambiguous. But either way, the rest of it is certainly clear that texts from JSP 11 comprise the text in figure 18, part of 13, and 14 and 15. So similarly, on figures 13, 14, and 15, these figures also need to be turned right side up and flipped around. Although the numbering from figures 12 through 15 in the original 1842 publication of the Book of Abraham was printed upside down as well, meaning the Arabic numbers were upside down, potentially indicating that the text was deliberately inserted upside down. Nonetheless, the text can be aligned with the hieratic text in JSP 11, once again, on row 4. Some of those figures are clear matches. Some of them seem a little bit more ambiguous. But it seems clear that, again, from row 4, this text is inserted in figures 13, 14, and 15. It may not be as clean as we might have hoped for, again, but a match can be made when looking closely at JSP 11 in facsimile number 2. So based on Heward and Tanner's theory, using our current versification, Abraham chapter 2 verse 1 through most of 2 verse 2, and half of chapter 2 verse 9 through all of chapter 2 verse 18 were all included in facsimile number 2. Fortunately, we know what Joseph had to say about this text since he provided the explanations to facsimile 2. Interestingly, looking at the undamaged portions of the hypocephalus and the damaged portions, but filled in with various Egyptian hieroglyphic and hieratic characters, Joseph chose to comment on some figures and refrained from commenting on others. Sometimes he provided explanations for undamaged figures, and sometimes he refrained from explaining undamaged figures. Sometimes he provided explanations for damaged figures, and other times he refrained from explaining damaged figures. It just so happens that literally every figure containing any hieratic text from JSP 11, Joseph's response Joseph's response is that the explanations will be given in the own due time of the Lord. And he concludes his explanations by saying, the above translation is given as far as we have any right to give at the present time. In other words, literally all of the JSP 11 hieratic characters included in facsimile 2, Joseph Smith deliberately declined from commenting upon because he believed that the translation would at some future time be given in the own due time of the Lord. Joseph clearly indicates that he did not translate JSP 11. When critics went to put Joseph at the helm of the extant Book of Abraham manuscripts using JSP 11, some irony becomes apparent with the publication of the Book of Abraham and its incorporated facsimiles. The timing of these explanations are interesting. On March 1st, 1842, Joseph Smith, taking over as editor of the Times and Seasons, published the first installment of the Book of Abraham, which in our modern versification included facsimile 1 with its accompanying explanations, and Abraham chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 2 verse 18. This first installment constitutes the entirety of the Abrahamic text from the extant Book of Abraham manuscripts from the Kirtland Egyptian papers. A few days after the first installment was published, Joseph Smith spent time with Reuben Hedlock. Reuben Hedlock engraved the plates created the plates for the facsimiles for the Book of Abraham. Writing, exhibiting the Book of Abraham in the original to brother Reuben Hedlock, so that he might take the size of the several plates or cuts, and prepare the blocks for the times and seasons, and also gave instruction concerning the arrangement of the writing on the large cut, illustrating the principles of astronomy. The large cut referring specifically to facsimile number 2. So Joseph's involvement in the text included seems to be the case from this quotation here. Approximately 2 weeks later, facsimile 2 with its accompanying explanations in Abraham chapter 2, verse 19 through 5:21, the end of our book of Abraham was published, and the third facsimile was published in May 1842 with its accompanying explanations. So according to Heward-Tanner, Joseph Smith published his translation of the first third and one-third lines of hieratic text from JSP 11 as Abraham 1:1 through 2:18 on March 1st, 1842, only to include half of those hieratic characters on facsimile 2 with the admonition that the explanation for these characters would be given in the own due time of the Lord, and that he had no right to translate those characters at the present time. My argument and rebuttal to Heward-Tanner, and the hundreds of accounts since 1968 by others who have repeated this argument, is that Joseph Smith concretely provided direct evidence in facsimile 2 that he never translated JSP 11, and that the answer has been under our heads this entire time, if we would have taken Heward-Tanner's work one step further. Additionally, related to Heward-Tanner's work, it should still be noted that more than 50 years later, relatively little work, piecemeal at best, has been done on the Kirtland and Nauvoo Egyptian papers. They've been documented and published now, and that provides the means to study them in depth. While an in-depth investigation of the Kirtland Egyptian papers is beyond the scope of this presentation, I would simply point out a few things. One, Samuel Brown pointed out that W.W. Phelps' interest in Egyptology began as early as July 1834, since he published that, quote, Egyptians could astonish the universe, concealing their arts in mysterious characters or hieroglyphics, end quote. Phelps seemed to have had a strong level of influence with respect to the Egyptian records and manuscripts. Second, in W.W. Phelps' recent biography, Bruce Van Orden noted that Ezra Booth claimed that Phelps had boasted of believing he was a master of 14 different languages. Third, Will Scriver had previously pointed out that some of the Egyptian documents contain foreign characters, including Arabic and cryptic characters like Masonic ciphers. He also pointed out that the relationship between the collection of Egyptian documents is far from clear at this point. Fourth, the Egyptian translation project took place alongside an interest in the Adamic or pure language, and that there's some relationship between the Egyptian records and efforts with this pure language project. Sam Brown has done some excellent work in this regard, and his publications should be further pursued. Fifth, the English translation project also coincided with Oliver Cowdery's purchase of, quote, Hebrew grammars and lexica, in addition to Greek primers and Webster's English lexicon, end quote. This was followed shortly thereafter with the hiring of Joshua Satius to teach Hebrew. The combination of these factors points towards the secular efforts to understand foreign languages and provides some basis for understanding the Kirtland Egyptian papers. In combination with these factors and the evidence I've discussed thus far, this then should give sufficient pause for thought regarding the intent, purpose, method, and participation regarding the Kirtland Egyptian papers. Now, aside from this, we know from eyewitness accounts that the record of Abraham and Joseph contained black and red ink. Hoare's document of breathings made by Isis has no rubrics or no red ink in any of its extant papyri fragments. When the text in Abraham 1:12 and 1:14 refers the readers back to the facsimile 1, the depictions at the beginning of this record, we're talking about hieratic characters that are 3 inches away from the vignette, which hardly needs to be called out if the vignette had a direct relationship with the text nearby. Next, as has been pointed out by John Gee and then by others, Shinha, which appears in Abraham 3:13, also showed up in the August 1835 Doctrine and Covenants in several instances. Warren Parrish, whose writing comprises the majority of the Book of Abraham manuscripts, didn't even arrive in Kirtland until October or November 1835, thus suggesting that translation through Abraham 3:13 preceded these Book of Abraham manuscripts. Further, If Joseph thought he was translating the Book of Abraham, following Facsimile 1 in the Book of Breathings, why didn't he start with the text immediately before or after the vignette on the papyri? In fact, from the Kirtland Egyptian papers, we have some of these hieratic characters written down on the Egyptian alphabet documents, with no explanation, translation, or other commentary whatsoever. Thanks to the work done by the Joseph Smith papers in the Revelation and Translation Series, Volume 4, we have clear indication that the characters adjacent to the lion couch scene, or Facsimile 1, in Hor's Book of Breathings, have no translation whatsoever in the Kirtland or Nauvoo Egyptian papers. This further points us away from the idea that the text next to Facsimile 1 was the basis for the Book of Abraham, but was the project of some other but related effort. The fact that JSP 11 is included in Facsimile 2, and Joseph explained that he was not at liberty to translate these texts, in combination with all of the other information provided, as well as all the other information provided by other scholars up to this point, leads us to believe that except for those willfully blind, the case is far, far from closed. By addressing part of the problem in the primary argument regarding the translation of the Book of Abraham, I hope this evidence from the hypocephalus, the evidence that has been under our heads this whole time, adds some important insight to help alleviate concerns that tend to arise when members are confronted with the primary controversy surrounding the Book of Abraham. My hope is that this additional evidence will help improve faith in the prophet Joseph Smith, cause Latter-day Saints to be more discerning when met with critical arguments, and inspire greater due diligence when confronted with information that they do not have answers to. Thank you.
Are we on yet? Oh, there we go. We're on. We are on. Excellent. So this is new. I haven't seen before, at least for me it is, something new I've learned. I guess what I should ask again, you've already said it several times in your presentation, is what is your opinion of the books that claim immediately that the Book of Abraham cannot be true because the translation and such, Joseph Smith didn't translate it right. We now know it's wrong. So you said it in your presentation, but just go ahead and say it again in short English.
Sure thing. I'm not making any statement as to what the Kirtland Egyptian papers are intending to accomplish, but my argument, plain and simple, is that the papyri fragment known as JSP 11 has text on Facsimile 2, and Joseph Smith deliberately declined from translating that text when providing explanations on Facsimile 2. So if there's any concrete evidence regarding how Joseph Smith felt regarding JSP 11, we get that from his explanations to Facsimile 2. So what W.W. Phelps and Frederick G. Williams and Warren Parrish were trying to accomplish, I think my point is that there is much work that needs to be done there still to help us get a better understanding of the context of the purpose and the methodology and the intent of what they are trying to accomplish, why it's incomplete, why there's multiple copies from Warren Parrish, why those copies differ from each other. There's just a lot more work there to be done. And I think the argument that JSP 11 is the Book of Abraham is a surface argument. It has no depth. It says, look, this and this and this match, so therefore this is the translation, but it ignores all other relevant context.
So it goes and it reinforces, as you stated, John Yee's argument that we all agree, both sides agree, that document is not where the Book of Abraham came from.
I agree with that 100%. The Book of Abraham did not come from JSP 11. Now, I don't know whether the Book of Abraham came from hieratic text from other papyri scrolls that we no longer have, Or if there's some catalyst theory, we know he got his translation by revelation, but I do not have a conclusion on that matter at this time, other than simply saying that it seems clear to me that JSP 11 is specifically not the Book of Abraham.
So what do you say to those people who read, one of the books on the Book of Abraham that allegedly proved the Book of Abraham not being a translation, and they've left the church because of that? Because I've talked to some of these people who that was their issue. They said that was their silver bullet. They'd learned the Book of Abraham was not a translation of those papyri, and so they've left.
Sure. And perhaps two answers. For whatever reason, the missing scroll theory seems to become pejoratively spoken of recently. And I think there's still work to do there, and obviously scholars who are qualified in that arena have done work, and I will probably continue to do work in answering that. But in the Joseph Smith Papers Conference in 2018, there were some fantastic talks given there. And some of the things that were pointed out in that conference, for example, is that Joseph Smith's method of translation seemed to vary over time. Meaning, with the Book of Abraham, he had his Urim and Thummim, or interpreters, and he had his seer stone that he used to translate the Book of Abraham. But around the time of the Egyptian papers...
Or Book of Mormon or Book of Abraham?
I'm sorry. The Book of Abraham translation with the Urim and Thummim and the seer stone. Then with the Book of Abraham in 1835 and the Book of Abraham manuscripts, Joseph's interest went in many directions. He got a Hebrew grammar and lexicon. Mm-hmm. He got a Greek, either grammar or lexicon, I don't recall. And he's working with W.W. Phelps, who claims to know 14 languages, who took an interest in hieroglyphics prior to receiving the papyri. And so it seems to have been a different effort regarding the actual documents that we have. And I think there's some evidence that Joseph Smith received the Book of Abraham either by the seer stone that he had or by direct revelation, either as Warren Parrish or as Wilford Woodruff with the seer stone had mentioned. So we also have the scenario of Doctrine and Covenants, section 7, right, where there was text that Joseph Smith didn't have present with him, that was written by John, and that he provided a translation to. So I think our interpretation of what it means to have revelation and translation, there's some nuance there, and it's not necessarily a black and white issue, especially since none of us were involved in those projects. But as we can see how Joseph Smith uses that vernacular over time, he simply has no problem, he seems to have no problem adjusting things or altering things. So for example, if the text from the Book of Abraham manuscripts in 1835 comprised the actual Book of Abraham, he says that he was translating it again in 1842. Well, the 1835 manuscripts never says in the heading that it was purported to be written by Abraham, but in the publication in 1842, Joseph adds in the header that this is text purporting to be written by the patriarch Abraham.
But that was added later. Right?
It was added later. So my point is, if people are concerned about is this translated this way or this way, I think it's more we need to get a better understanding of what it means when Joseph used the words translate. And in the case with the Book of Abraham, we have very little evidence regarding what we actually have as the Book of Abraham.
Okay, I got some questions here I'm going to read. Do you have any insight in the other figures in Facsimile 2 that Joseph declined to translate?
I think that's a great question. And honestly, I don't think I could answer that very well at this time. So
okay.
Perhaps another day.
Next question. What do you think is the strongest evidence for the missing scroll theory?
Well, we certainly know that there were scrolls that were burned in the Chicago fire. Again, we have several instances where eyewitnesses refer to the record of Abraham and Joseph being on black and red ink. And I know some have argued that some of that is within the current, the possession of the church's current papyri. I think the work that's been done, and there's been back and forth regarding the length of the scrolls, and I'm not a mathematician, so I would decline on opining on that. But I think John Gee's article of Formulas in Faith, where he tests that formula on an existing scroll and provides the idea that the length of scroll fits within a range rather than a very specific number, is much better than using a photography or a photograph of a rolled up papyrus fragment to determine the length of a scroll. So then you also, of course, have the eyewitness accounts. What does it mean to have a long roll? Again, Joseph F. Smith reported to Preston Nibley, who reported to Hugh Nibley, so it's rather late, but refers to the papyrus roll that unrolled from one room to another. So Joseph F. Smith was quite young at that time, but there seems to be evidence that there's certainly a much larger extent of papyri that we don't have, that Joseph did, than what we do have now.
Okay, thank you. Question: because the characters in Facsimile 2 and Papyrus 11 are the same, and because Joseph Smith did not provide an explanation for the figures, that is why Joseph Smith could not or did not translate it. Is that an accurate representation of your argument?
Yes.
Is the possibility that while Joseph Smith was looking at the writings, it triggered him to receive revelations about Abraham, thus seeing the information as a blessing rather than a false document, to be a matter of faith rather than a matter of science?
I'd have no problem with that argument, other than, again, for JSP 11, where he used those same figures, the same hieratic characters on Facsimile 2, and said that he could not translate those at this time because they were to be given in the own due time of the Lord. So I'm not opposed to the idea that Joseph Smith was looking at Egyptian papyri, and some portion of it acted as a catalyst to giving him a revelation of the Book of Abraham. I'm not opposed to that possibility, but I have no conclusion on it, since it's simply still a matter of conjecture.
Okay. What resources would you recommend for learning more about the translation of the facsimiles?
Well, that's a great question. So Michael D. Rhodes translated Hypocephalus, or the facsimile number 2. I think that was in 1977, if I remember right, and then did it again 20 years later with an update. Michael D. Rhodes translated the Horror Book of Breathings, or the Document of Breathings made by ISIS, and that's published in the Studies of the Book of Abraham series. And then we also have in, forgive me, I have not finished it yet, but Quentin Barney just finished a thesis on Facsimile 3, in which he includes 32 of the 33 extant copies of the Book of Breathings. I believe there's a translation of Facsimile 3 in there as well. There are external sources, of course, regarding the facsimiles, but I would start with Michael Rhodes and go from there.
Here's kind of a good summing up question. Do you believe the Book of Abraham is true?
Of course, absolutely.
Okay. With that, I want to thank you so much for your time here. And here's our traditional speaker gift that you have for speaking.
Thank you very much.
So, yeah, we pay the big bucks. We give people a brownie when they come and speak. Okay. So it's good. So thank you so much.